Hey, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you, even if only virtually tonight, and looking forward to our time together. And thank you to Anna and to the Center for inviting me to be with you and to talk about a topic that may off the top seem somewhat dry, but I'm hoping in the course of our time together, you will become enamored of the process of grant writing and see it as actually something that not only hopefully will lead you to funding that will allow you to put your ideas into practice, theory and practice, which the money is needed in order to do, but also will help you use the process as a way of actually moving your project forward. And so as Anna said, I myself am a documentary filmmaker, but I also work in the industry. And over the course of my many years in the field, I've just had a lot of success with grants. And as a result of that, I've sort of figured out sort of a system like a roadmap. And so what I'm going to share with you tonight is a PowerPoint presentation that sort of lays out sort of a step-by-step process that I'm hoping will be useful for you when you are next embarking on a grant application. And I'm hoping that by having like a roadmap that you can follow, something that is often intimidating to people will seem less so by the end of our 2 hours together, and will also help you see how you can use this in your artistic practice, that it obviously is a means to an end, but hopefully it also will help you really clarify your thinking about whatever project it is you're working on. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. Just one last detail, it's hard because I've got a PowerPoint presentation and I'm here in New York and most of you are in Lafayette, but I'd love this. Sorry?
No, you're good. Are you about to talk about asking questions?
Yep.
Yeah. You go on and then I'll give them information.
Okay. So yeah, I'd love this to be as conversational as possible. And I really consider this your time. So I want to be, of service and as helpful. So please feel free if you have questions. We've allocated enough time to allow for your question. And now here's where Anna comes back in.
Yeah, so only because we don't have a mic set up in here. If you do have a question that you want to ask her at any time, just come closer to the laptop and the microphone on that will pick it up. Alternatively, you can type into the chat box, which will also provide her the question. But if you don't want to type on the laptop, please just pass me a note and I'll type it into the chat box as well. And there'll also be opportunities to ask questions at the end of every section as well. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so on that note, I am going to share my screen, I hope. Yep. Okay. So can everybody see that? Is it full screen and you can see it? Okay. So here's a quick overview, a very, very quick introduction to me and my work and a point I want to make. Then some basic principles of fundraising, of which there are 2 that apply across the board, whether you're appealing to individual donors, whether you are doing working with foundations and funders, whether you're doing a crowdfunding campaign. There are 2 rules of thumb that apply no matter what you're doing. And then the question, how do you find the right funders? And then finally, which is what we will spend the lion's share of our time going through, the individual elements of a grant application, and we'll break them down and basically talk about strategies that you can use when you're working on any given particular element of your proposal. Okay, so me. So I did this film. I co-produced and directed this film about a man in theater who was somebody who was a huge influence when I was growing up. His name was Joe Papp, and he started Free Shakespeare in Central Park here in New York, and he also founded what's called the Public Theater. It's the theater that the play Hair, A Chorus Line, more recently Hamilton, originated from. Anyway, he was very much a social visionary who influenced me when I was growing up. And the film wasn't broadcast nationally on PBS American Masters in 2020. It was broadcast this past June. Then 3 years ago, I produced a film called Grit. And one of the things I wanted to tell you about this, which was a lesson that I learned in working on this film, is, as you can see, there's a very compelling photo on this slide. And so this film is set in Indonesia. It's about a company that was drilling, a multinational drilling for natural gas in Indonesia, and they strike an underground volcano of toxic mud. And overnight, a tsunami of toxic mud consumes 17 villages. And the film is about the villagers' fight to get compensation. Their homes, their jobs, their livelihoods, everything has been upended by this fracking gone wrong. Anyway, the filmmakers were approached by a photographer who wanted to go with them to the site of this mud flow. And the filmmakers agreed that she wanted to do a photo essay, and they agreed that she could come with them, but they made a deal with her that any photos that she took, they could have access to, that we could use them for our own promotional purposes. And what I learned from this was that anytime we would get a grant, the funder would issue a press release saying, in the past 6 months, let's say the Sundance Documentary Fund has awarded 10 projects grants, and all the projects would be listed, but then they would need either an image to attach to their press release or an image to put on their website announcing, the latest set of grant awardees. And because we had such strong production stills, every time we would get a grant, our image was the image that they invariably used. And what that meant was that while everybody who got a grant got publicity by being in a press release, we were always like the headliner because we were on the landing page of a website, or we were the visual image that everyone used. And so for me, that was a real revelation on the importance, depending obviously on what your discipline is, of having very strong visual images that you can use to promote your work. Okay, I should have updated this. I realized when we started that I've successfully raised now over 3 million in grants. But if you amortize that over the amount of time it's taken me to do that, it's probably like $1 a day. It only sounds good in the aggregate. Okay, so this is the headline from an article that appeared in the New York Times a few years ago, and it was talking about just how difficult it has become to get into the top Ivy League colleges, where now currently the average acceptance rate is between 95 and 96%. So that means out of every 100, right, only 4 to 6 people get in. And I think they were profiling like Harvard, Yale, and I think Stanford. This is obviously Stanford. Well, to get a grant from the Sundance Documentary Institute or for another funding organization in film called Chicken and Egg, the percentage is actually between 2 and 4%. It is actually easier to get into Harvard than it is to get a grant from Sundance. And I'm not telling you that to like make you realize like, oh, how could I have thought, to be an artist? Like I should have realized like this is an insane way to earn a living. I should be doing something much more practical. The reason I'm telling you just how competitive it is that there's an enormous amount of work that goes into writing a grant. I find it valuable because, as I said, I really find it helps me think through my project and clarify my creative ideas. So it has that benefit unto itself. But I really think, given how competitive grants are, it's really important to sort of go in eyes wide open and ask yourself if your project really is a good fit for grants. Is this the most strategic use of your limited time and bandwidth? And so not every project is a good fit. And so I think it's just something that is worth thinking about when you make the decision to do this, that you do it sort of eyes wide open. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there are two basic rules of fundraising. The first is that it's all about relationships. No matter whether it is with a foundation, whether it's with an individual funder, right? You want to think of this as having long-term significance, right? No matter, hopefully, whatever project you're working on now is only one in a body of work that you will be creating over your lifetime. And we'll get into this later in the webinar, but we're going to talk about what the grant process is from the inside, like what it's like if you're in a grant panel and having to make the decisions, going through the applications, like from start to finish. We'll go through that very briefly, but I think it will help you understand that there are many criteria that go into these decisions. Sometimes, for example, if you're applying to a federal funder like the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment for the Humanities, those funders are funded by taxpayer dollars. If all the grants were awarded to New York-based filmmakers in their media division, right, you could imagine that there are senators and people in Iowa or in Louisiana or in any other state who would be up in arms that taxpayer dollars are only supporting artists in one place. And so when they're evaluating what projects they're going to support, not only are the merits of the project a variable, but there are other considerations, many of which we don't know. It could be you're doing a project that's about environmentalism. It's an art project that deals with the environment, but that year they had 12 competitive projects. So I just also want you to know that there are many factors that go into making these decisions. And merit is obviously first and foremost, but there are others. And so if you are thinking about the people that you'll be dealing with, whether they're funders, whether they're donors, whether they're investors, taking a long view of your relationship with them, not just focused on the individual project you're working on now. Perhaps the current project is not a good fit, but that doesn't mean that your next one won't be. And so by taking the long-term view, you are opening a door that can benefit you somewhere down the line. And so I always think it's important to look at these relationships and to be at all the industry events for whatever your discipline is, anywhere you can build your relationships, like those of you who are attending this workshop tonight, right? You're starting to meet people in your field and start to build relationships. And that is, to me, a critical part of the sustainability aspect of the work that we do as artists. Okay, the second rule is that artists who inspire confidence in their work make for successful fundraisers. So what do I mean by confidence? It's not people who brag and are, very full of themselves. That's not what I'm saying. But when you are in a grant panel, and often I've been on a lot of different funding panels, you often start with somewhere like 500 applications for which you only can fund 10 to 15. And when you see all of these applications side by side and you're reading one after another, those that convey a sense of passion, a clarity of vision, a sense of inevitability, like come hell or high water, this project is going to be done. Those sort of leap off the page. And so it is surprising how a written document can actually convey confidence in a certain way. I think of the proposal, when I send that in, it is a stand-in for me. It is, short of mailing myself into the office of whatever funder I'm applying for or being there to make the case in person, I feel my proposal is my emissary, and therefore I want it to convey my excitement about the project, that I've anticipated every kind of potential obstacle in my way, and I've figured out what I would do, like every contingency in case of a problem. Do I need permits from a city if I'm doing a public art project? If I'm going to shoot video on the subway, is that legal where I'm planning to shoot? So all of those kinds of things that are in a proposal showing that the artist is thought through every eventuality, that's the kind of thing that inspires confidence, even in a document, a text document. Okay, so where to find funders? The first thing that I do is I look up, or I brainstorm what other projects are similar to my own. I showed you the photo from Grit, the film set in Indonesia. Well, when we were working on that film deals with drilling for natural gas, which we call in the US fracking, gone terribly awry. And I was thinking to myself, okay, what other films are there out there that's about fracking? And I thought Josh Fox did Gasland. So then I realized, okay, here's a film. And whoever funded that film, I know two things. I know they fund film, and I know that they're interested in this subject. So the first thing I do is I make a list of all similar projects that have anything tangentially to do with my subject or somehow seem like they're similar in theme to what I'm exploring in my project. And then I will go on that artist's website, or if it's a film, I will scroll to the end of the film where the credits are. Every project has to acknowledge their funders. Websites do that. So that's like my starting place, is like, okay, who are the obvious funders? What else have they funded that is vaguely in the same wheelhouse as what I'm doing? Then there is an organization here in New York called Creative Capital. Some of you may be familiar with it. It is known for supporting individual artists. They give a grant of $50,000, and they have multiple disciplines. They support artists of all stripes. It is an unbelievably competitive grant. I've done grant writing workshops for them for many years, and I've never been on their panel, but I do know from people who have applied, it is extremely competitive. But they do have on their website, at least when I last checked, an updated list of a list that they constantly are updating of all kinds of grant opportunities, residencies for artists of a variety of disciplines. Then there is another site called Artwork Archive, and they also have a really good list of opportunities whether it's grants, whether it's residencies, all sorts of different things. And they update it, I think, every 2 months. And then two others. One is Fractured Atlas, which is a fiscal sponsor of artists, and they also have upcoming deadlines. And I apologize, I realize I should have updated these links. But if you look up these organizations on their website, you will find the current iteration of these listings. And then the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, has a grants database. In addition, one of the hardest things to find is to have access to successful proposals. And NEA, because it is publicly funded, has to share that information. And so you can look on their website. Unfortunately, they don't give you the entirety of an application. They'll give you like the project description of, let's say the discipline is media. So that will have blogs, it will have websites, it'll have film, it'll have video, it may have animation. And so what they'll have is like a section from each of those different specific categories. And so it gives you some sense of how people have, what they've said and how that has been worded. So I often look at the NEA site also to see partial samples of grants. And then finally, the NYFA website. NYFA is the New York Foundation for the Arts. They have Source is their listing of all kinds of grants and upcoming deadlines. They also have a very good job database. I think it's a national jobs database in the arts. So it's a very good site. It's worth checking them out from time to time. Okay, so now let's start talking about the process of writing a grant. And let me just take a quick pause. Any questions so far? Anything not clear? Okay. I'm going to take that as we're okay. Okay. So one of the key things to think about when you are applying for a grant is, right, we are all in the fishbowl, right? We know that, you know, in the case of a filmmaker, let's say I know that there is some incredibly important development on my project, and that I need the funding to be able to go out and cover it and film it and hire a cinematographer and a sound person. And it's going to happen in 2 weeks, and either I'm going to get it or it's, you know, it'll never happen again. And I know that my rent is due in 3 weeks, and that if I don't make my share of the rent, my partner is going to kill me and then leave me. And I know that, you know, I've just got all these bills I need to pay. So I'm inside the fishbowl with all of my needs and knowing what I need. But funders, right, they're outside the fishbowl looking in. And in order to be successful, right, our job is to step outside the fishbowl and to write the proposal from their point of view, right? Your proposal is an opportunity to make the case, right, that you are a good fit for this funder. And I had hoped to be able to show you, you know, those great cat videos where there's a cat and there's a small box and the cat jumps in the box, which it clearly doesn't fit in. And then that box is taken away and an even smaller box is there. And then the cat tries to get into the smaller box. But it's hard to do videos, so I had to settle for this cat. But my point is, right, that anytime you are applying to someone, right, you need to know what it is that their mission statement is, right? Every funder has a mission. And so no matter how much you want the funding, if your project doesn't align with the funder's mission, right, you're like this cat, right? You're trying to fit yourself into a box And you look foolish because what you're saying is you haven't done your homework. You don't know what it is they're looking for. And so really the proposal is your opportunity to make the case as to why you are a good fit. And that's what, just that mindset of knowing what the mission statement is and trying to frame your application without ever saying anything you don't believe to be true, but really focusing on highlighting whatever you can that shows the funder this, right? I am the answer to your prayers. This is what you were hoping for. Okay, so I'm guessing that most people, right, the thought of grant writing, right, you'd rather clean your toilet or, you know, do anything but that. But I'm hoping that soon, as we go through now, the elements of writing a proposal, that will not be the case. Okay, so grant writing is an exercise in getting funding. It is not the same thing as actually making your work. And what I mean by that is we have an idea, right? We're not bankers. It's not like this is something that has a prescribed set of steps. This is a creative process. It evolves over time. As you work on your project, I'm telling you stuff you already know, right? It will change. It will change as your idea becomes more clear. It will change as circumstances allow. You know, if you're making a documentary film, it's not scripted. There are variables you can't control. You're often following an unfolding event, so you don't really know where your story is going to go. And so I think people often get caught up in the fact that they don't know every detail of their project, and therefore they can't write their grant. And that, I think, is really the wrong way to think about it. That's why I like to use the process. Like the very first thing I do when I have an idea for a new project, before anything else, I start working on my grant proposal for two reasons. One, it's the place where I work out my ideas, like my basic conceptual framing of my project. But then it's also, I'm starting to think ahead. The funding process takes a long time. Most grants only have a deadline once a year. From the time you apply, it's often 6 to 8 months before you hear back. I can't afford to wait 2 years to start putting my applications in. So I start like day one, I'm starting to work on my proposal, knowing that my proposal is going to change over time as I get more clarity, as the project develops, and I am more clear. So it has never happened to me that a funder has said to me, you know, we funded your film, and on page 6, you said that the character was going to go to a wedding, but there was no wedding in the film. It's, you know, they know that you are saying what you know to be true in the moment that you are writing the grant. It is, that's why I'm saying it is an exercise in getting funding. It's not making the art. Does somebody have a question? No.
I do. I was going to ask, do you file for multiple grants for the same project? And is there some issue that arises, like if you, God bless, you get many for the same one, is there any ethical problems there?
Good question. No, in fact, the reason that I start writing my grant right from the beginning is that I create what I call a master proposal. It's sort of my generic proposal that answers the questions that you find on almost every grant application. So if for some reason I find myself at a cocktail party or out on the town and somebody asks about my project, like I have it ready to hand to them. But I really want to be ready to apply to as many grants as possible First off, because, if the percentages are between 2 and 4%, the likelihood that you're going to get funded is small. And so I think of it as planting seeds. Like, I want to get out as many proposals as possible to as many funders as possible. And usually most funders, in fact, I can't think of hardly any funders, they only fund a small part of your project. So for example, with documentary, the Sundance Film Institute would give you between $25,000 and $50,000, but most films cost, upwards of $500,000. So you have to be raising money from multiple sources. And in fact, which we'll cover in a little bit, every application asks you what your fundraising plan is, because they know that they can only give you a small part of your funding, but they want to know that if they give you money, it's not going to go, you're not going to, that you've got a credible plan to raise the rest of it, and that their money isn't going to go to waste. And so I think it's assumed in the field that you are going to raise money from more than one source. And, in the worst case scenario, which, I pray that you sometime find yourself in, I pray that I at one point in my life find myself in, if you got 2 grants at the same time that were covering the same things, and the money would be more than you actually needed, then you could say, we really appreciate this. We don't need this funding. And, we hope that you'll consider us in the future. But I've never, in my experience, even if you get every grant you apply for, you still never have enough to pay yourself for all the time and effort you've put in. And most grants are not unrestricted. They're very specific. So some, I don't know if this is true in other disciplines, but there are often development grants and then production grants. But I do think, especially since it is standard operating procedure to have a fundraising plan, most funders are anticipating that whatever money they give you is only going to be a fraction of what you need. So I don't think you have to worry about that, which is why I try to start getting this process underway so I can plant as many seeds as possible, knowing that both statistically, chances are high I may not get it, but also that it takes so long. I want to be able to keep evolving the project while the grants are out there, with the funders doing the work they need to do, going through that long, arduous process. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. Moving on. So like any skill, any craft, the more you do this, the better you'll be at it. And yeah, I guess for me, because I now have this system of how I go about it, it's just okay, I do this very mechanically. And yet I do, and maybe it's just because I am, a crazy kind of nerdy person, I do find the process really beneficial. I can't say I love the process, but it does feel creative, because I have to have enough clarity that somebody else can really understand what my vision is. And I know that sounds abstract, but we'll talk about that. And then the other thing is, even if you don't win, competing will strengthen your project, and you will get on the radar screen of people in your field. So as I said earlier, often your project is you did an environmental project, and they had another environmental project that they liked just slightly more than yours. They could only fund one environmental project out of the whole round because they had other considerations they had to take into account. And so they'll come back to you, you then have made a favorable impression on a funder. And so the next time you apply, perhaps with a different project, they will remember you from having, been a very competitive applicant in the previous round. So I always think, as long as you are putting your best foot forward and not just throwing something together for the hell of it, it does seem to me it serves your interest to be circulating your name and getting on people's radar screens. Okay, so I've said this, right? It will help you. The process helps you clarify and refine your ideas. And then it also starts to give you language that you can use when speaking about your project. Like I find that when I'm writing my grant, it's like I find the words that really make sense. Like when you get it right, it's like, right, that's what I mean to be saying. And then I have the vocabulary when I'm talking to people. And it is almost like I find myself repeating sections of my application when I'm pitching my project, like in an elevator pitch or, at a pitching event. Okay, so one question which seems obvious, and yet I would argue is not, which is, why should I care, right? This is, again, we're in the fishbowl. We know why the project is important to us. But if you then again step outside the fishbowl and you think about a funder who is looking at 500 applications, of which they can only fund 10 to 15, you want to think about, okay, why is this one going to stand out? Why should they care about this over the other 499 proposals that are there? So I never take that for granted. And I always try to make the case, like why this, if you're only going to fund one project, this is the one. Another thing that I think people often forget, oddly enough, even though we work in a visual universe, especially as artists, is that what you're writing about is something that is either, if it's a sound project or a play or a dance or a painting or film, whatever it is, you need to describe things in such a way that it conjures vivid visual images in the person's mind. So this is another photo from that film I mentioned earlier, Grit. And we were at a pitching forum for films in Toronto, and we were struggling to find like the exact language. We had 3.5 minutes to pitch the project to a room, 300 of the most important people in the film industry, and then 3 minutes to show our trailer. And one night, one of the directors said, I want to bring people into a world. And that is a phrase that has become a touchstone for me, because it really captures what you want a successful application does. Is it really is like you're telling someone a story, and you're making the work that you're proposing come alive on the page by describing it in visual, vivid language that really allows somebody to imagine it as they read it. And we're going to go into that as we're going to go into more detail as we go through the presentation. Okay, so there are 3 questions every grant must answer, right? Why is this the one project, right? We just touched on that. If you can only fund 10 to 15 out of 500, why this one? Why is this the most important one? Why are you the person to make this project? What do you bring to the table? Are you connected if you're doing a project about a community or that involves a community? Are you from that community? If not, how do you relate to that community? Do you have unique access to a story or to some kind of project, right? That would be a good reason. And then why do we need this now? And later, when we get to what it's like inside the grant panel, we'll talk about that question of why now in more detail. But suffice it to say for now, that projects that really speak to the present moment, or you can explain why there's a compelling reason it should be made in the here and now, are also going to be more competitive. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Okay, so now I'm going to list the, I think there are 8 elements of the grant application, which we're now going to start to go through. Right, the project description, the most important part, it really is the heart of the project. The personnel and credentials, right? Who is the team behind this project? The timeline. So from the time the funding is awarded, how long do you envision it taking you to complete the project? Right? Funders want to know this is going to take 20 years, even though it probably will. They want to have a sense of what you think is a realistic time frame for completing the project from the time you have access to the funding. Okay, then they want to know there's an audience for your work. Who is going to see this? How do you intend for this project to reach its audience? So it's not only who is the audience, but how are you going to help ensure that that audience has access to your work? The fundraising plan, which we touched on just a little while ago, right? Showing that if they give you part of your funding, you have a realistic plan for how you're going to raise the rest. Budget, obviously, right? What are the full costs of the project? That is not the most important element of a project, but it mainly shows credibility, like that you know realistically what the costs are. And as I said, we're going to go through each of these. And then the final one is the work sample. So there's 7 elements, not 8, right? Either digital images of your work or some kind of audio recording, if it's an audio project, or footage, if it's a film. If you're a composer, I guess it would be a recording of that works of pieces that you've composed. Okay, so these are the standard, for my generic master proposal, these are the things I put together. Okay, but all of these 7 elements have to work together where they're all feeding into an overall story, a narrative. And so each one is like a piece of a puzzle that provides one more piece of information. And I'll tell you as we go through these individual elements how I think about this to make sure that I am being as strategic as possible. So one of the things, just as we're about to start on this, is I think about what things I want a funder to know. So for example, one of the directors of the film Grit, the one set in Indonesia, was an Academy Award-winning filmmaker. Well, you can imagine that was something I wanted funders to know. So I could put that information in her bio, right? That would be an obvious place. But I could also put it in the project description, like sound, right from the outset, like, hey, this film is being made by, this very successful filmmaker. Or I could put it in the distribution plan, or I could put it in all 3. So I'm constantly thinking to myself, what key pieces of information do I want to share with a funder? And where will they most strategically serve me to incorporate them, right? It's up to me where in the proposal I put certain bits of information. I'm just always thinking, okay, here's like, these are my assets. Just make sure that they find their way in. And so that's when I'm talking about an overall story. It's that every piece is sort of building up the case as to why you're a good fit, and why this project is the one, right? Why this is important. Okay, so now starting with the most important element of any grant application is the project description. So let's imagine for a minute that I am an inventor and I have an idea for a superhero action figure. and you are all investors. And I come to you and I say, you know, I have this idea and I would like you to give me the capital to allow me to make this superhero action figure. And I would then present you with this, basically a blueprint. And by looking at this blueprint, right, you can see what the figure would look like from the front. You can see that what it looks like from the side and from the back. There's at the top, there's sort of a detail of the head, which is obviously important. Now, this is just a scrap of paper, right? This isn't the thing itself. It's a theory of something I'm proposing to make. It doesn't exist. But by looking at this, I'm imagining that if you were an investor, you could tell whether this was something you thought had potential just by looking at these drawings. Okay, another example, right? So metaphorically, right, your project description is the same as a blueprint. Okay, let's say I'm an architect and you came to me and you said, Tracie, I'd like you to build the house of my dreams. And I came back to you and I said, okay, and you had described what you had in mind, or I had read your mission statement, and this is what I presented to you. Now, you don't know everything, but you would know that if you hire me, right, you're going to get a house that has 2 stories. You'll know because there's a chimney that I plan for you to have a fireplace. You will have a sense that this is not a Federalist style house or a Georgian style house. I have no idea what style this is, but let's call it a modern house or I don't know what. But you would have, by looking at this, you would know how many bedrooms there are. You know how high the ceilings are. You'd have some sense of what I had in mind, enough of a sense that you could make some kind of informed decision whether I was proposing something that worked within the vision of the house that you want. Right? Can you imagine this house existing in your mind's eye? Right? From looking at this blueprint, could you imagine this existing? I'm assuming the answer is yes. And so to me, right, let me go back. What I am trying to do with a project description is to create a blueprint so that when a potential funder is reading it, they can see in their mind's eye what I am proposing. They have some sense. I'm pulling back the curtain on how I am thinking so that they have an idea of what they would get if they gave me the grant. Now, again, as I said earlier, our projects are constantly evolving. Nobody is going to come back to you and say, you know, in the proposal, you said this, unless you do something that is completely unlike what you proposed. But if it changes, if it evolves over time, if you find that you have creative challenges that you have to solve in ways that you didn't imagine when you first started, funders understand that. So the whole process is just being able to articulate a vision so that somebody could imagine it in their mind's eye, that they could see what you have in mind from the way you write your project description. Okay, why is this not moving? Okay, there we go. So in addition to helping a funder envision your vision, right, you need to help them see any like stylistic or thematic qualities, any use of technology, if you're using sound in an innovative way, if it's a place-based project like a public works, like give me a sense of where you could imagine it existing. Make it as real as possible so that when I'm reading it, I could imagine this project being realized. Okay, so the project description should answer these questions, right? What makes it unique? What is distinctive about it? Is there an innovative use of technology? And what is the aesthetic approach? And often grants, in addition to the project description, they'll have a separate section that is either the stylistic approach or the artistic approach, where you describe sort of the materials that you plan to use, or if you're a playwright, the scenery. Is it a 3-act structure? If it's a film, are you using cinema verite, or is it interviews? Are you using archival footage? What are you using? Are you working with a composer? What, how do you imagine the sound? All of those kinds of things are details that show, this is again about showing confidence, right? That you've really thought this through and that you really do have a vision. And basically what you're saying to a prospective funder is, the only thing standing between me and a finished project is your money. And even though that is definitely not true, and I think of this as like the Wizard of Oz, like behind the curtain, it's like, that's where you're sort of, some of what we're doing is performative. Like, I never say anything I don't believe is true, but I'm of course putting myself forward as far more like, oh, piece of cake, just give me the money and, in a week I'll hand you a film. It's like, I know that once they give me the money, I'm like, oh no, what do I do now? I have enough of a sense, but the creative process is an evolutionary process. I wish that weren't the case. I wish I could go from A to Z without all the steps in the middle, but I've never found a way to do that. But you have to say to a funder, right, that you've thought it through enough that you really have something that you could now take and start to put theory into practice. Okay, let's stop for 1 second and ask if anybody, is everything clear? Any questions so far? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Can you go back 2 slides?
This one?
No. One. Go forward 1, please.
Go forward. Okay, this one?
Yeah.
I'll be sending a link to the recording to everybody as well. So
Okay.
you can have to, but yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I had got that one down. That's the only one I missed, sorry.
Okay, so we're good to go forward?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, no problem. Okay. So we're still focused on the project description. So one of the things I feel is very important is to create context. And what do I mean by context? And this is the hardest concept to explain and to understand, but I'm hoping, and you'll tell me if I'm not being clear, but to me, it's like your project exists in a bigger universe. So I was teaching a class the other day and I said to my students, there is a famous painter who sadly died last year named Chuck Close. And for anybody who's familiar with his work, he did these huge portraits, paintings, that when you looked at them from afar, they looked like photorealism. Like you'd really think initially like, oh my God, that's a photo, a giant photo. But as you got closer and closer, you realized that not only wasn't it a photo, it was a painting. And not only was it a painting, it was a painting made up of like hundreds of thousands of individual little squares of paint. And that combination somehow magically came together to really create this sense of photorealism. And it really was amazing. It was like you could see the process and the finished thing at the same time. So I've always been a fan of Chuck Close's work, and I always thought if Chuck Close had ever asked me to write a grant for him, he did not ever need anybody to write a grant for him. He was in an enviable position that his paintings, I'm sure, sold for millions. But if he had ever bothered to call me and said, could I write a grant for him? I was thinking, okay, in the 19th century, there were painters called the pointillists, like Seurat, who used all of these dots of color to create these paintings. And the most famous one is, it's like, there was a Broadway show called Sunday at the Park with George. It's a Seurat painting, I think, of picnickers in Paris on a shore. And it's a very beautiful, like 19th century, everybody looks gorgeous, and men with canes and women in beautiful dresses. But if you looked at it up close, it was just a series of dots. So if I were writing the grant for Chuck Close, the context I would create is that in the history of art, there has emerged, or a century ago, a strand of art, a particular area of art emerged with the pointillists, who used color and drops of paint to create their canvases. And now, 100 years later, Chuck Close is now taking pointillism to its modern and logical extension. So I am connecting this artist, right? He wasn't born into a vacuum and he exists unto himself. I am connecting him to a tradition, to a larger universe, and placing him within a context of where he fits into the history of art. Let me think of another example. Nothing is coming to mind, but okay. Well, so with the film about Indonesia and and fracking, right? We were making a film, right? 3 women from the United States, 3 white women making a film set in the world's largest Muslim country, Indonesia. And why would an American funder be interested in funding our film, right? We're not from Indonesia. They're not they didn't have a particular connection. So I started the grant. At that time, fracking, particularly here in New York, was very controversial, right? It was a big election issue, if you recall, in 2020. And I started the proposal by saying, at a time when fracking is headline news, here is a project that will help illuminate this debate. So I was saying, I was building a bridge for a potential funder of saying, this film exists in the universe of fracking, an issue that's important to you. And here is a specific story that is going to help illuminate this very contentious issue here in the US. So what I'm always trying to do, and this, here's Chuck Close. This is an example of his work. And so one of the reasons I think it's interesting, and this painting doesn't really give you a sense of what it's like when you're in a gallery where you don't see all of the squares initially. If you're far enough away, it really just looks like a giant photo. And so here's what I would, connect him to the larger history of painting in the 19th century and saying he's carrying that tradition forward in his own way in a modern context. So when I start my proposal and I'm writing the project description, right, I think of an upside down triangle. And so to me, the context is sort of the larger universe in which my project exists. And I put that at the top, right? It's the big, broad brushstrokes, the big issues, the themes that my project is going to address. And then as I go further, like once I've painting that big context, right, that big picture, I then am starting to narrow down. And once I have the context, now I'm going to start to talk about the particulars of the project. How do these big ideas play out in this actual project? So if I had been writing the proposal for Chuck Close, right, I would start to talk about what his projects look like, right? What I would describe a painting and talk about, unlike the pointillists in the 19th century, this is what Chuck Close does. And I would talk about his particular form of expression on the canvas. So I'm translating, I'm setting the stage with the context, and then I'm narrowing in on the more narrow base of the triangle by now talking about the specifics. How does this big idea translate into an actual project? And with a film, it is, so I mentioned I would talk about fracking and setting up, here's a project that will help illuminate this debate. And then I'll talk about the actual story we're following and the characters. And through them, you will see how fracking played out in their lives. So I know this is a bit abstract, but I'm going to read you a quote from an Iranian visual artist named Shireen Nishat, and then explain how I see this as context. So I'm going to read her quote. Her quote is, "Part of me has always resisted the Western cliched image of Muslim women, depicting them as nothing more than silent victims. My art, without denying repression, is a testimony to the unspoken female power and continuing protest in Islamic art." So how I read that is, before I've ever seen anything by this artist, she has given me sort of her mission statement, her philosophy. She's pulled back the curtain so that I understand how she thinks as an artist. And she's saying, right, she's from Iran. She's a Muslim woman. And she is now living in the West and sees that in the West, Muslim women are often depicted as, silent victims wearing a hijab, powerless. And she said that it's like one-dimensional. And yet she's not denying that there is a lot of misogyny in Islam, as there is with most religions. But that her art is also countering that one-dimensional image she sees in the West without reducing it to the other extreme, that she wants to show also the power in and protest of women, that women have voices in Islamic culture. And so now, without even seeing her work, I have a frame of reference to understand what she is trying to do in her work. And so if that were the context at the top of the triangle, then I'd be ready for her to start to narrow down and to start to tell me what specifically she has in mind. Okay, wait, we've been joined by a guest who's been standing at my feet. Whenever I'm on a Zoom call, my cat Misha likes to, I think he doesn't like that other people are getting my attention. So forgive him, but he'll be with us for a minute or two. Okay, moving on. Right, so from the context, I narrow my focus and I start to describe the actual proposed work. But I've given somebody bigger ideas as a frame. for my work. So does that make sense? I know it's a lot to take in. Everybody realizing that being an artist is a silly way to earn a living and that there are easier things to do in life. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on then. Right, so now I'm saying the same thing again, right? You're translating the broad brush strokes, the themes laid out in context into a detailed vision of a project, theory and practice. Okay, some applications, right? I said this a few minutes ago, ask for a separate section on your artistic approach. But sometimes they don't. They just ask for a project description. So if that's the case, I then make a subheading within my project description, and I then talk about my stylistic approach because I want them to know that I've thought that through, and I want to bring them in, again, bring them into my world, how I am imagining my project. Okay, so to give you a better example of how this works, this is a photo by Robert Mapplethorpe, and I had this epiphany about 2 years ago during COVID, when museums finally started opening. I went to the Guggenheim, and there was an exhibition of Robert Mapplethorpe, and this very beautiful painting, photo that he took. So now, right, we are just seeing an image. We have no other information. We can either like it or not. But what I notice when I go to museums is that on the wall, in addition to the art, is a text card, right? There are always those little squares. And I'm one of those people who reads all of them when I go to a museum. And so I'm going to read to you what the text card, there are 2 slides of the text card for Robert Mapplethorpe. Okay, so it says, throughout his career, Mapplethorpe often drew upon forms found in antiquity for inspiration in directing his compositions and his sitters' poses. Okay, so now I already know, right? He had a connection, his art stemmed from a connection for him with antiquity, okay? These influences are further reflected in the artist's fixation on the classical ideal of physical beauty and unrelenting pursuit of perfection as he presented the flesh of his living subjects with the strength, stillness, and solidity of sculpted marble. Right now, let's go back and look at, oh, come on. Right, right now that I see it, right now, I have a much different understanding, right? It does look like sculpted marble. And now it's like the artist, I've been allowed into his thinking in a way that just looking at the image did not give me a full enough picture. Okay, so the second one, this is from the same description of that same image we just looked at. So they have a quote from Mapplethorpe, and he says, if I had been born 100 or 200 years ago, I might have been a sculptor, Mapplethorpe claimed. But photography is a very quick way to make a sculpture, right? So again, I'm getting more and more information that makes my understanding of his thinking and what led him to make the choices that he did so much more rich for me as somebody who is getting to know this artist and his work. Okay, so the final paragraph, the artist's approach to picturing the human form reflected his keen interest in the terms set forth by classical Greek and Roman statuary, placing his work in a long-standing homoerotic tradition that celebrated the nude male figure. So now I have a far bigger frame of understanding for the work of Mapplethorpe by having read that description. And so I'm hoping that example and the quote from Shireen Nishat helps you understand how you can bring someone into your thinking through your writing and creating a bigger universe for them to understand your thinking as an artist. Okay, that is the hardest part. And I hope, it'll take some thinking, to digest that. Okay, so I mentioned at the outset that we would be, I would try to give you the inside, like what it's like from the inside of the funding process, because I find it really helpful to understand what goes on so that you sort of have the strategy. You're not in the dark. Okay, so, right, from 500 applications received, we only have funding for 15 to 20. So what are we going to do, right? Do the math, right? What are we going to do? We're going to go through every application. And obviously, the first thing we're going to do is make sure they're all complete. Did they include a budget? Did they have a fundraising plan? Did they include their work sample? Whatever it is. So let's say 15 people out of 500 didn't complete it. Or, for example, I've had this experience. I've been on funding panels for funders who fund films by and about women. And there once was a proposal by a man. He identified as a man. He was a cisgendered man. He identified as a cisgendered man. But he made the case that his film was about such a strong woman that he should be considered. Well, if the funder's mission is to fund films by and about women, like making that case just made him look foolish. So that's why, right, reading somebody's mission statement and making sure at the outset that you are a fit, that you have a reason to think your project could be funded, that is key. Right. And where I was saying about, even if you're not funded, you get on someone's radar screen. If you do something where you're showing that you've not really read the mission or you're ignoring it, you get on their radar screen, but not in a positive way. So, okay, so the first thing, right, you get rid of anybody who didn't complete the application, anybody who doesn't fit the mission, like they're completely out of, they just do not belong. And then you're going to read them all, you're going to look at all the work samples, and then you're going to start making hard decisions. So from 500, you're going to cut it in half and go to 250. And then you're going to probably read them again, and you're going to rank them again, and you're going to cut from 250 to 125, but you're still far from the 15 to 20 that you can ultimately fund. And you're going to, continuously whittle down the process. So from 125, let's say, get down to 60, and then you're going to cut that in half, and now you're at 30. And now it's like Survivor, right? It's like anybody who has made it to this point, like these are 30 unbelievably competitive applications. And in a world with, decent public funding of the arts, all of these projects should be funded and would be funded. But unfortunately, we're in a position where we only have enough money for about half of them. So now, I know it's hard to feel sorry for funders, but now the funders are in a position of having to make choices between equally competitive projects. And now you're looking for reasons not to fund a project. So here's where something we touched on earlier becomes really essential. So if you have two equally good projects, okay, and I'm going to let you guys weigh in on this, you can vote on this. Yeah, for the next 3 minutes, you get to be funders. You are well-endowed funders, and you're on a panel, and you're choosing between two equally good projects, but we can only fund one. Okay, so one is my Joe Papp film, which is about this amazing social visionary who created free Shakespeare in the Park, modeled his theater after, it's called The Public, after the public library, because he believed, like a library, everyone should be entitled to access to great art, regardless of ability to pay. He was the first person to do what we call non-traditional casting, social visionary, changed the cultural landscape. Okay, He died in 1991, and my film is what I'd call an evergreen. So whether it's made this year or next year or in 10 years sort of doesn't matter, because the subject is dead and it's sort of a timeless story. Okay, so that's one. And my dad will tell you it's a great project and you should be voting for my project. Okay, but then we've got the film. Okay, let's say I go up against Cynthia Wade and Sasha Friedlander on the Grit film. Let's say that wasn't finished. And that's a film that is dealing with this controversial issue, right? Let's say we're just before 2020 and fracking is like, let's say there is a legislation, we should pass federal legislation either for or against fracking, and it's something that's headline news. And here's a film that's dealing with this issue, though it's, set in a different context, but it looks at it from all different sides. And that's what I would call a timely and urgent film. Okay, so they're both great, right? My dad loves my film. And so now, but we can only fund one. Okay, by a show of hands, and I'll see if I can see you. Who is voting for my Joe Papp film, the evergreen film? Oh my God. All right, I'm gonna have to commit suicide when this is over. Okay, who's voting for the timely and urgent film about fracking? Right. And every single time that is what will happen. And so remember earlier on, I said, why now? Right? That's one of the key questions. Why you? Why this? Why now? Making your project relevant to the present moment, if you can, or tying it to something that says why it should be made now, is only in your favor. And obviously there are projects where that isn't the case. And you never lie, but thinking strategically what it's like inside the funding panel, I'm always trying to, like, I feel like I know well enough now how to write a grant that I can get myself into that final 30. And so when I'm writing, I'm always thinking, if it's between me and someone else, why are they going to fund my project versus someone else's? So I am actually working on a film right now. My newest project is about, it's this outrageous story set in 1849 about a riot that came about, 15,000 people in the streets of New York over a production of Macbeth that led to the death of 22 people in 1849 and marked the first time American troops fired on American citizens. But when I wrote the proposal for that, I made the case, which I believe with all my heart, that this film is the most urgent and timely film any funder could fund, because it actually helps us understand our present moment by seeing that certain themes, political divides that we have that are playing out on the stage of democracy right now actually happened 150 years ago or 120 years ago. And so I am linking the past and the present. And I'm working with a panel of scholars, and we had a one-day conference, and every few hours we had to stop and say, like, we could not believe how this story could be set today. Like, it was just uncanny. And so I am always signaling why this is timely. And it's not, in the case of a historic documentary, just a relic of the past. So that is, like, that's one of the things I do. Okay, and I'll give you some other tips of things I do, but it's something to always be thinking about. If it's between you and someone else, what can you do that's going to make the case for your project over another, worthy project that that both should be funded, but that's not the reality in which we live. Okay, so moving on, personnel and credentials, right? This section is the one that answers the question, why you, right? Why are you the person to make this project? So did somebody have a question? No, okay. So in this, right, one question that artists often have is, what if I'm a first-time artist? I'm applying for my first grant. I don't have other grants. I've just entered the field. Right, then one of the things you can do is you can surround yourself in your team with people who are more seasoned, right? People who have credentials, who may be recognized in the field. And by the fact that they're on your team, that confers legitimacy on you. That's one thing to do, right? You can talk about if you have a track record, right? What awards, what exhibitions you've been in. You can talk about your education, but then you can also talk about life experience. So, for example, I was teaching a few years ago, and one of my students was a retired corrections officer. She worked in a prison, and she was retired, and she also was the mother of a 13-year-old son. She's African-American, and so she was a first-time filmmaker, and she was making a film that she called The Talk. So if you're white and you say The Talk, generally that is the talk that parents have with their adolescent children about sex. But if you're Black, the talk means something else. It means the talk you have with your adolescent, generally son, about what to do if he's stopped by the police. And so this woman, because she worked for law enforcement, right? She was a correction officer. She knew the world from the side of law enforcement, but she also knew it as the mother of a teenage Black son. And so even though she had never made a film before, there was nobody who was more qualified to make that film than her, right? I mean, even Cynthia Wade, an Academy Award-winning filmmaker, she didn't have the perspective, the experience that this woman did. And so life experience, making the case why you are the best person, that you have unique access, is a reason that you should make this, you should be the one doing this project. So it's always sort of thinking strategically and trying to think a bit outside the box to be able to make the case, putting your best foot forward. Okay. Right. I suggested this, right? Adding people who have a track record, and they confer legitimacy on you. Okay. So timelines. So I know this is really bizarre, but this is where most people screw up and are disqualified. And it's ridiculous, but it's like a mere technicality. And so if you take nothing else away from this webinar, this is the most important point I'm probably going to make tonight, which is that every grant that you apply for has a stated grant period, right? It says that the funding award starts on this date, and generally they last for a year, but there is a defined grant period that goes from one date to the other. So often it's June 1st to May 31st of the following year. And so the very, very first thing I do when I am looking at considering applying for a grant, and I think we should make a sacred vow tonight amongst ourselves that everybody will do this, I look at what is the stated grant period, because when I write the timeline, I need to say to a funder, from the time you award this grant and I can start using the funding, I'm projecting these milestones, and ultimately that the project will be finished by this date. But often what people do is, let's say today is September 8th, and our grant, we submitted the grant today, but we're not going to hear back until next April. What most people do with their timeline is they say, okay, starting September 9th to December, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And then from January through March, I'm going to do this and this and this, and then I'll be done in April. So what you've now told the funder is you're going to be completed with your project. Your project is going to be completed before they even allow you to start using the funding. And so you've now just disqualified yourself by suggesting that you're going to finish the project before the funding period begins. And so the first thing you need to do is to look at what that grant period is to make sure that your project will extend long enough, far enough into the project, into the grant period, that you will be able to use the funding, and not by not thinking this through have disqualified yourself. I mean, I see that with filmmakers all the time, right? It is now, it's September, Sundance deadline is like in 2 weeks. And so people are like, yeah, I'm going to be done with my film by January because I want it to premiere at Sundance. Well, nobody between now and January is going to make a funding decision. And so by saying they're going to have their film done in time to premiere at Sundance, they've just told me they're not going to be eligible for the funding they've just applied for. And so it's really important that you make sure at least 6 months into the grant period, and sometimes funders say this is a grant of 12 months. You can always finish it earlier. There's never a downside to that, but you can never finish it before the grant period starts. And it's just something you don't really think about. The other thing, which is makes life harder for us as artists, is that no funding is retroactive. So you can only apply the funding within the grant period. So if you've spent, let's say, right, we submitted our grant today, we're not going to hear back till April. It's not like we submit the grant, we pack our bags and we get on a cruise and go to the Bahamas for the next month, next 8 months, and come back in April when we hope the funding decision will let us know the great news that we just got the grant. Like, we're still moving the project forward in that time frame, but that's all on our own dime, not on the funder's dime. And so when you are working on your budget or on your timeline, you just have to remember that your funding, all funding goes forward from the time the grant starts. And, it's in the case of filmmakers, we have to make samples, we have to go out and shoot, we have to hire an editor and a cinematographer. It's a lot of front end costs and time that is all on the filmmaker. But you have to have those elements before you can even apply for a grant. But it's just important to remember that the funding is prescriptive going forward, never retroactive. Okay. I've just said this. Okay. Right. Timeline needs to be to cover the period in which the potential funds would be available. Right. And this shows that you've read the guidelines. So credibility here. Okay. Audience distribution, right? Is there an audience for your work, right? If you're a funder, you want to know there's going to be a hunger to see it. So one of the things I do here, again, I'm trying to think, it's between me and someone else. What's going to give me the competitive advantage? So here, what I often do is I get a letter, either of commitment, right? If I've worked with a gallery before, and I say to them, oh, I'm working on a new body of work, is this something would be of interest? It doesn't have to even be a letter of commitment. It could be a letter of interest. They could say, we've been honored to have hosted shows of your work in the past and are very excited about this new project that you're embarking on. And we hope, we look forward to considering it for a show. That's not saying they're locked in stone, they're wedded to it, but they're saying it's expressing interest. It's showing you've taken initiative and are starting to build those networks for the final project to be out in the world. I do that. I get, if you're doing like a site-specific piece or you're involving community groups, get letters from them telling a potential funder why it's so important to them, why they're so excited. So I've now told you all about Joe Papp. Well, I just went to see Shakespeare in the Park on Saturday night, and the production that they do one play that's all like, actors and in equity and SAG, professional actors. But then the second play of the summer is a community-based production where they have a handful of professional actors, but then everybody else are from community groups. So there are senior centers and dance troupes and kids. They had people from, I think they said from 8 to 82. And so there were all of these community groups represented. They had people from every borough in New York, all 5 boroughs. If I were writing the grant for funding for that project, I would have asked for letters from a senior center. They've participated in these in the past. It's been so meaningful to the people who are in the plays. And then if the grant application allows me to attach additional attachments, I'm going to attach all of these letters of interest, of support. But often now applications are online and you have to fill in these stupid boxes, that they have like 87 characters or 4 million characters or 1.5 pages. And you can't attach anything that is outside of what is required. In those instances, I still get all of these letters, but then I'll take a quote from one of these letters and I'll say in my distribution plan, even at this early date, while we're still in production, already there is widespread interest in this project. For example, the Senior Citizen Center of Riverside Park said, and then I'll put a quote in. And so it seems to me, right, if they're 2 equally competitive projects and one has already a gallery that's interested in, or a theater that is, might show it, or has a community-based group that is excited by it, that just might give me the competitive advantage if I'm in that final round and they're having to decide between me and someone else. Okay. This is interesting. So years ago, I was at an event, the president of the Ford Foundation was speaking, and he said that he loves projects that have crowdfunding. And I thought, really? Why? And he said, because it shows that there is widespread support for your work and that you're already out there building an audience. And I thought that was fascinating. I wouldn't have thought of that. So if you happen to do a crowdfunding campaign, it's worth mentioning it and saying, we had 50 supporters, we had, 800 supporters from $20 to $250 or whatever it is. And then the other thing that I do, again, going back to looking at similar projects, is I try to draw a parallel, right? I'm always trying to take some reader, a potential funder by the hand and build a bridge for them to see the world through my eyes. So with the film Grit about fracking, I had mentioned that I looked at Josh Fox's funders for Gasland to see who funded that. Well, then I also, when I was writing the distribution plan for this film, I was like, well, what film festivals showed it? Where was it seen? And so then I did that bridge, taking them by the hand. I said, there is clearly a hungry audience for films that deal with fracking, given the enormous, overwhelming interest that there was in Josh Fox's film Gasland. And so I talked about all the places it had been seen, and we are anticipating that our film will have a similar, if not even more enthusiastic audience. So I'm making the case that there is an audience, whether it's by drawing a parallel with something that's similar or, getting a letter of support. So that's just one of the ways I work on this. Okay. So with Joe Papp, when I was working on it, one of the things we would say is, after more than a decade in the making, Joe Papp in 5 acts is nearing completion. Once finished, the film will be broadcast nationally on PBS American Masters and will be widely distributed to classrooms, libraries, community groups, and via digital download and DVD to individuals. So I'm telling them, like, we have a game plan like this. Now, did we know that? We did. We knew that American Masters, they were by that point on board. But even if I could have gotten a letter from them just expressing their interest. It didn't have to be saying that, that they were committing. Okay. Okay, fundraising plan, right? Everything here is about credibility. So I said this earlier, if you're a funder, you want to know if you commit a percentage of the funding, the artist will be able to raise the balance of the funding. And I often see proposals where people just list like every funder under the sun, but people in philanthropy know what funders fund what, right? If you're in visual arts, all of the philanthropists who fund visual artists know each other. It's not like there's a huge universe out there. So if you put, let's say, the Ford Foundation, and the Ford Foundation doesn't fund visual arts, you've already undermined your credibility. Or like what happens with filmmakers is you're making a film. Let's say we were making a film about Chuck Close, right? A biopic about an artist. If we said the Ford Foundation, which has a film division, was going to fund this, again, we've undermined our credibility because Ford Foundation funds social justice films. And a film about Chuck Close could be a great film, but it's not a social justice film. So now I know that the artist doesn't know the funders, right? So their credibility has been undermined. So, I mean, that's why I said at the outset, doing this is a great process, but it does take a lot of work. And so it's always important to decide. We all have such limited capacity and more work than can be done reasonably to decide, is this the best use of your time? Are there other ways that you could raise money? Because I think it's an important question to ask given what it entails. Okay, budget. So I said this earlier, right? You want to show them you have a realistic sense of what it's going to cost. And I think often people think that by having a lower budget, they're more competitive. But that is not necessarily the case. So I can give you an example. I often see film budgets that are like $75,000 for a feature film. And I just think to myself, like, right. What that tells me is that they're not going to hire a competitive editor, because editors cost $3,500 to $4,000 a week in film. Of course, producers get paid almost nothing, but that is the going rate. And anybody who is a film funder is going to know that. So if you have a budget of $75,000, you know, as a funder, that person is not going to have like a top level editor. And so that raises a red flag right there. On the other hand, if it's too high, but having a high budget, it's not about the amount, it's about the logic behind it. So there is a very, very famous filmmaker, and she's making a film and using like a lot of home movies and a lot of like oral histories. And there's not any travel involved that I'm aware of, but the budget is like close to $1 million. You think, well, why would that be? But when we made Grit, that budget was almost $900,000, right? Similar to what this other film is costing. But on that film, the two directors had to fly to Indonesia 8 times. They were filming the head of a multinational who was a very outlandish character. And we had to have, I didn't even know this existed, kidnapping insurance. Well, who knew? And security. So those costs made our budget extremely high. But because we could explain to funders, like pull back the curtain on the logic of that, amazingly, we raised the entire budget in grants, and not once did a funder ever ask us about our budget, because we revealed the logic that explained why this budget was so high. So I feel like it doesn't matter whether it's high or low. I'm working with a filmmaker who's married to her editor. Good move. Our editing costs are really low, right? Because if he wants to stay married, he's going to work on this film for very little money. But I made sure to make that clear in the application. So I said, so I turned that into an asset, right? I said, we're in the enviable position that this team includes a husband-wife creative team, and the husband is the editor, and therefore our budget for editing is very low, keeping our costs down. So now that's a positive. Whereas if it wasn't explained, I would just assume they're not going to have like a competitive editor. Okay, work sample, right? You want to contextualize that in relationship to your previous work. And right, are you going in a different direction? Is this building on the body of work you've already done? If so, what's new? You know, I think it's, again, in the way that reading to you the text about the Robert Mapplethorpe photo helped us have a better understanding of his thinking as an artist. Talking about what your intentions are helps bring a funder into your world and have a sense of you as you start to exist as an artist in their mind, and as does your work. And so using that description of your sample to illuminate some further piece of the puzzle about your work and where you're planning for it to go. It's like all of these, I see these as opportunities for me to add different points that I want to make throughout the grant. Okay, we're almost done. I know you guys must be tired. It's a long presentation. So what is this? We're now at the elephant in the room phase of this presentation. This is a Banksy. And what is the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room is any issue that you wish a funder would not think about. So are there any similar projects out there, right? Is there the cost of a project that requires international travel? The elephant in the room is something that could raise a red flag. And you want to not just leave it there unaddressed, you want to anticipate any red flags, and you want to remove them peremptorily by providing the information. So in the case of the Grit film, because our budget was high, we knew that would be an elephant in the room, and therefore we were very clear on why that would be the case. So it's really important. So if there are similar projects, not just hoping like, oh, la, 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 I hope that the funder doesn't know about this other film that's about the same subject as mine. It's saying, right, there are a billion films about the Holocaust. It's a subject, it's just so many. If you're making a film about the Holocaust, you better tell us what you are adding that hasn't already been covered. What is new? What is different? Why do we need this film now? Okay, conclusion, right? Think of the proposal and the sample works as two halves of the whole. What I try to do with the proposal is to bring them into my thinking, to give them as much context and understanding of what I'm envisioning. And then I want the sample to actually like bring them into the work itself, like that they're excited and they can see that I can deliver what I've said. Often, like, and this is mainly for film, I'll see a proposal and then the work sample covers the exact same territory. The filmmaker will describe a scene in the project description, and then I'll see the scene. And that's not an effective or strategic use of your application. You want each part to do different work. And so the sample should give me a sense of your craft, your skill, your ability to hook me emotionally, something that is different than what you can do with the text. And then something I said at the beginning, right? Every element in your proposal should support an overall story, right? Each piece should give another piece of information that is, again, making the case why this project. Remember, we're artists. Describe your terms, your project in vivid visual language. Think of the blueprint, right? Think of yourself as a conjurer, and you want someone to see what exists in your imagination so they can imagine it existing in their mind's eye. So like if you're working on a film, describing the sound, right? The sound design, the music, those things add. Okay, and then the final conclusion, the grand finale conclusion, right, is the elephant in the room. Anticipate any all potential questions a funder could have, and then remove those red flags by pulling back the curtain, by explaining your logic so that they're not left filling in a blank, because they could fill it in a way that doesn't necessarily serve you. Okay, so we're down to the last 8 minutes. This is the end of the presentation. I've got my filmmaker's toast, which I'll share with you before we sign off, but I just wanted to leave a few more minutes in case anybody has any questions. So yeah, now's your now is your opportunity if you haven't had a chance to ask them. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Barely.
So I'm curious if I think my biggest hurdle is approaching a grant and then finding a project that fits it versus having a project and finding a grant that fits it.
Right.
And I think that's where I get hung up because I don't have time to sit there and I don't have time. It's just hard.
It is hard. There's no question. I mean, it really, it's insane what we do. I mean, there's just no question about it. But that's why I start with looking at similar projects. Like, I think you have to start with a project. I don't think, because even if you get the funding, as I said earlier, like it's never going to be sufficient for what you have to do. It's always going to be a struggle. It's just the nature of the arts. They're not, unless you're doing something that's highly commercial, which most of us aren't. And therefore, it has to be something that you care enough, passionately enough about, that you're willing to invest your time and effort in what is, an uphill struggle. And so I would say start with the project and then try to think of similar projects. And one resource that I forgot to mention, thanks for your question, because it gives me a chance to share this with you, is New York has this, it's like a library called the Foundation Center. And its URL now is called Candid. It's CANDID.org. And if you were in New York, you could physically go there. It's like a library of all foundations and nonprofits, because foundations and nonprofits are, because they're tax exempt, they have to provide certain information for transparency's sake because they're not paying taxes. And so there are certain tax forms and information they have to disclose. And the Foundation Center is like the repository of all that information. And so if you're in New York, you can actually go there, and they have these amazing reference librarians that know everything there is to know about grants. And they have these amazing, amazing databases that you can use for free. But if you're not in New York, and I don't know, I haven't looked since COVID, they may still be closed. They were obviously closed during COVID. they have online resources. Now, what you can use for free is somewhat limited, but you can do some basic searches. And then they have like subscription, like you can pay a fee and then you can talk to their reference librarians who are so knowledgeable. But that is also a really great resource to be able to do research, because obviously identifying potential funders is key. And that's why, like, when, as a filmmaker, when I watch a movie, like at home now on Netflix, I have my iPhone right beside me. And when I get to the credits and I get to the funders, I put it on pause and I take a photo and I save all of those, because I am always trying. That's always the challenge, is how do you find the funders? So it's always being creative. When I go to see a play, I'm looking in the playbill, like, who are the funders? If I go to see an art show, like, I'm like, okay, you know, who paid for this show? So it's always, you know, it's crazy, but that is what I do. But I agree, it's a lot of work.
If you apply for a grant but don't get it, is
Yep.
it possible to ask why? Like, if there was something that made you get rejected, or is that confidential?
So it's a great question. You know, I always, actually, here's a rule of fundraising that I also should have mentioned, and this applies in response to your question. I feel like you can ask anyone anything as long as you give them a graceful way to say no. So, for example, many times it is really an issue of capacity. If you're Sundance, right, you have like such a small, like Sundance, it sounds so big, but they have a really skeletal staff. And to go through the 500 applications, like, I'm sure it's like 3 people who are doing it, in addition to everything else they're doing. And so often it is just a question that they just don't have the resources. But I'm working with a filmmaker right now. And so we made it to the second round with a project and didn't get it ultimately. So she wrote to them and she said, you know, would it be possible to get feedback? But so what I do is I'll send an email and I'll say, thanks for letting us know. You know, obviously we would have been much happier had we gotten the grant. Knowing how busy you are, or maybe I'd say, you know, is there any chance that you could give us, you know, a few minutes of your time to give us some feedback? And certainly I understand if that's not possible, given your busy schedule, but if there's any way you could make a few minutes, you know, give us a few minutes of your time, it would be so enormously helpful. So as long as they have a way to say, you know, I'll be totally understand if you can't do it, but if you could, it really would make a big difference. Then they don't feel lousy if they say no. And so I feel like with anything, you can ask somebody pretty much anything, as long as you say, you know, if for whatever, when I ask somebody for a reference, right, that's always such an awkward thing. You're putting somebody on the spot. And I say, look, if for any reason this puts you in an awkward position, I will certainly understand. And then people often are much more gracious, because they're, you know, nobody likes to be in that position. And then the truth is that often you're not selected, not because of the merits of the project, as I said, but that there are other considerations, geographic considerations. Lois Vossen, who's the head of Independent Lens, which is a strand of independent documentaries on PBS, she said she has like 12 slots a year. That's it, 12 films a year. And she gets hundreds and hundreds of submissions, as you can imagine. And she says she sees so many fantastic, particularly environmental films. She can't have 12 films about the environment. Like, she has one slot, and then she's got like 800 other urgent issues she's got to cover, or whatever. And so she is often turning down films she thinks are fantastic because of the limitations of what she's doing. And so, as I said, like with federal funders, they're often thinking about the geographic distribution of projects. So I think one thing to always be aware of is that there are so many variables that are beyond the merits of your project, that it's just something to keep in mind. But I would actively encourage you to ask for feedback as long as you do it graciously.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, unless anybody else has any questions, we,
So it's just Anna here. I just wanted to like add on to a few of these things that we've been discussing real quick. And particularly your question about grant feedback. The programs that we run here at ACA, and maybe this is these are all very localized kind of comments. So maybe if nobody has any specific questions for Tracie, I can just follow up on a couple of things. Tracie, get on with the evening. Everyone good? All right. Well, thank you so much, Tracie, and yeah.
No, why don't you want to answer questions and that one thing about us following up on.
Yeah,
Okay.
I will follow up with everyone here, but I don't think Tracie needs to hear these because this is very local.
okay, I appreciate that. So I'm just going to leave you all with my filmmaker's toast, which is may the funding flow like wine and may the rights holders give freely. I wish you all full funding, and I wish you all the best of luck with your grant proposals. And with that, I will turn it over to Anna and wish you all a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye for now.
All right. So I just, as I said, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of those things. So in terms of grant feedback, all of the programs that we run here at ACA, we provide grant feedback. So we just did one for the Louisiana project grant today, and all of the applicants are actually invited to sit in on the panel discussion to hear the feedback live. That is not the case for all of the programs, but we do take notes in all of them, and we do have follow-up conversations if you want them. We're not going to force you to sit through the feedback if you don't want it, but we do offer that. I also wanted just to follow up on a couple of notes, because this is a very global look at grant making. A lot of this information is slightly skewed for the national programs. In terms of like the statistics that she's talking about, 500 people are not applying for our grants. Our grants programs, we're seeing more like for Art Spark this year, we had about 35 applicants, and we funded 9. So it's much better chances of receiving funding on a local scale. And it's a really good place to start with your funding, because we do the grant feedback for starters. You have more of a chance. We're closer. We can, form those relationships that she's talking about. And then from a regional arts council, then we would be looking at our state funders. We'd be looking at our other regional partners like South Arts. So there's like a pretty there's a through line into how to do this grants process if you do end up wanting to go on the national scale.
And review grants.
Yes, we review drafts before you submit. So we help you look through the guidelines and make sure that you're meeting all those guidelines. And she's absolutely right. The timeline thing, the dates, be very careful, because on a technicality, we have to disqualify things. So I did want to bring up a couple of opportunities, and one of them is an opportunity to be on a panel, so which gives you like the back end look at how we actually operate. So the way that she describes it is slightly different to the way we do it here. So as grant funders, we facilitate a panel discussion, but the panel discussion is made up of people within our community like yourselves. So I can provide you with a link to sign up to be on a panel if that is something you want to do at a later stage. And also on top of all of the lists that she has provided you, the links to the databases that have grants, we have a local one here, which is the Atchafalaya National Heritage Area put together as it's an Airtable database. And I can put this all in an email for you with a link to the recording. So you will have, you know, more localized opportunities available to you as well. And as I mentioned before, we will be having this panel discussion on the 1st of November. It's a free session. We've invited a bunch of funders from locally, from state, from regional and national to come and present to you the opportunities that are available. So please make sure that, you know, you're staying on top of that one. Does anybody have any questions for us before we wrap up? Okay. Well, so we've just finished. The only grant that we've got left for this year is an art grant for teachers. It's for LPSS. So anybody here who teaches in LPSS has an opportunity to apply for a grant. The next available opportunity will be Art Spark, which will open in January. And that is an individual artist grant of up to $5,000, which Carrie is one of the recipients from this year, so you can ask him all the questions you want. And then we'll be looking at the LCG and LPG, which is like summertime next year. But yeah, otherwise I just recommend following our email newsletter and our social media pages, because they're the most up-to-date information about the deadlines and upcoming opportunities. But thank you all for attending. Yeah. Hey, Aaron.
Wherever you are.
Yeah. I'm gonna shut down now, Aaron.